So let's take a look here at Scott McCloud, Chapter 6. And on our blog, this is part of the words and images posting here. And this idea about how words and images work together within comic books and graphic novels. So I'm going to start here by having us look at a PowerPoint from Chapter 6, which we got a bit of a breakdown here in this post. But let's start with actual PowerPoint here. So this is the show and tell. And of course, when we were younger, we started out combining words and images until, quote unquote, we grow out of it. Okay? And here is McCloud with us with the idea that traditional thinking has long held that truly great works of art and literature are only possible when the two are kept at arm's length. So you notice here on the left-hand side, he has War and Peace and all the Holy Bible, Grapes of Wrath, all these pieces of literature, and then on the far right-hand side, he's got all these famous works of art. But there is this separation. Okay, words and pictures together are considered at best a diversion for the masses, at worst a product of crass consumerism. So you'll see here ideas of advertisements, products, all kinds of fun magazine, trashy covers, that kind of thing. And then we start with this idea here that he says, as children, our first books had pictures galore and very few words because that was easier. So if you look here on the far left-hand side, you're going to notice that this young man grows up. And then, of course, he moves on here, and he's reading The Hobbit. And then ideally, he gets to this point where he's reading, as he's older and an adult, he reads nothing with it. There are no pictures. And then, of course, he ends this little sequence here with sadly the fact that there are people who don't even read at all once they reach a certain age. But there's supposedly this idea of a progression. That as we grow up, we move further away from pictures and more towards just words. Okay. Meanwhile, words and moving pictures have half the world in a thrall and their charms. But we must struggle to make their potential understood. So here he's talking about TV and movies. And he talks about words and pictures are as popular as ever. So comic books, graphic novels, but this is a widespread feeling that the combination is somehow base, simplistic. And when people think it's base and simplistic, there's this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that that's all it can do. So therefore, that's all they let it do. Okay? As mentioned in our last chapters, the earliest words were, in fact, stylized pictures. So he goes back, and this something he covered in chapter 1 and earlier, this idea of looking at the fact that early on, what we now consider words were themselves stylized pictures. He's got images of hieroglyphics and things of that nature, Mayan depictions. But in time, most modern writing would come to represent sound only. And lose any connection to the resemblance of the visible world. So it became more about sound. This is the area that linguistics deals with. The idea of how we pronunciate things and how things develop as we say them in our voice. I'm trying to remember, phonology, I think, is the term for that one. Of course, here he goes on to talk about the idea with the invention of the printing. So we're talking 15th century roughly here. We're taking this massive leap forward, so no longer do we have monks working on illuminated manuscripts or art. They're an artistic style to writing. We can now mass produce it. And so pictures are going to go a different way. So writing has gone its own little different way. And now there's a different change. So where the pictures go, because here's the written word. It's becoming more specialized, more abstract, more elaborate. And notice how his picture version, the avatar himself, disappears in the background. And less like pictures. Of course, pictures, on the other hand, meanwhile, began to grow in the opposite direction, less abstract or symbolic and more representational and specific. Okay, so it came less about being abstract or symbolic and more about depicting real life. Okay, and so we have two things here on this page. On the left-hand side at the top, we have a picture, an artistic picture. On the right-hand side, we have a poem by John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn. So McCloud says, by the early 1800s, Western art and writing had drifted about as far apart as possible. One was obsessed with resemblance, light, color, the visible things, that's the painting, and the other was the other was concerned with the invisible treasures, senses, emotions, spirituality, philosophy. So they kind of divided up. Okay. McCloud goes on to note here that pictures and words, once together, in the center of the iconic abstraction chart, the one we looked at in the previous chapter, that big pyramid, have at this point drifted to their opposite corners. Okay, so here's a little bit simplified version of that chart. You notice the smaller one on the left-hand side here, this one, we have a distinct vibe of, the Egyptian hieroglyphics where the words and the pictures appear to be at the center of the meaning line. And then here we are in the 1800s, and they've drifted all the way to their far corners. Well, if they're going to keep going, where do they go next? And I ask students in classes about this, and usually, the obvious answer, if I'm going left and I'm going right, the only direction left to go is up. Okay? Of course, this is where he gets to this point about this journey, where could they go? And of course, he talks for pictures, and he starts with that, because here they are over here on this far side with the P, with the resemblance, and writing's all the way over here on the side of meaning. So they had to go up towards the picture plane. And so here he talks about the idea of Impressionism, which sent Western art towards the abstract vortex, and it clung to what the eye saw. But in a way, it still clung to what the eye saw. But here's where it really gets interesting. So now this push upward is exploding into all these different artistic movements: Expressionism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Faustism, Cubism, Abstract Expressionism, Neoplatonism, Plasticism, Constructivism. And of course, as they're doing this, you'll notice that this is now working backwards. Not only is it going up, but it's curving back to the starting point. Okay? And so the main thrust of the return to the meaning in art, away from the resemblance and back towards the realms of ideas. So we're moving away from just this 1-to-1 ratio of resembling things and back towards this idea of having deeper meanings. All right. Meanwhile, the written word on this next image also is changing. Poetry began turning away from the elusive, twice abstracted language of old towards a more direct, even colloquial style. And so again, we have the John Keats Ode on the Grecian Urn, and then beneath it we have Walt Whitman facing west from California shores. And we're returning to this idea of, describing the world around us as being, so we're moving away from this hidden meaning things and more back to a simpler element. And so this represents where writing is now moving back away up and to the left as well. Okay, so we're headed for a collision. All right, the collision helped give rise to higher forms of art that for many audiences was not something that they found appealing. And this is a picture that I didn't include in the PowerPoint, but it's in the chapter where it shows some people standing in front of this abstract art going, I don't get it, I don't like it. Okay. So, because here's the problem, is that even though art is moving in this direction, and art and writing are moving back towards each other, the perception of great art and great writing hasn't changed much in 150 years. Okay, so the perception by the audience hadn't changed, even though the art forms themselves were expanding and reconnecting. Any artist wishing to do great work in the medium using words and pictures had to contend with this attitude in others and in themselves. To give you an example, I ask my students often about the idea of Stan Lee. Who is Stan Lee? And I ask them, and it pertains to this idea that people don't see this combination of words and images as great art. And they say, oh, that's the guy, the godfather of Marvel Comics, created the Fantastic Four, X-Men, all that stuff. He shows up in all the movies. Well, I asked him what's his real name. Most people can't tell me. His real name is Stanley Leibowitz, and he chose that to take his first name, Stanley, and turn it to Stan Lee, originally because it was a way for him to preserve his quote-unquote real name for the day he'd write the great American novel. Of course, that never happened. He stayed in comic books, and that's what made him famous. But it was that perception he had to contend with, the idea that creating comic books when he was doing it wasn't considered great art. Okay, so here we go, deep down. Many comic creators still measure art and writing by different standards and act on the faith that great art and great writing will combine harmoniously by virtue of quality alone. So here we have the artist all the way on the left-hand side, the writer all the way on the right-hand side. Of course, and this is where McCloud goes on here, the art form of comics is many centuries old, but it is perceived as a recent invention. It's conceived as a very American convention, creation of comics and comic books, but it's a lot older than that. And so here it is, it's depicted as a young new media. And of course, being young new media on this next panel, it has the curse of getting judged by older standards, even though it's not as young as it appears. Okay, and he goes back here to say that ever since the invention of the written word, new media have been misunderstood. Careful, Jacob. If you keep doing this, you'll stop using your memory. Here he is writing things down. Each new medium, though, begins its life by imitating its predecessors, okay? So early movies looked like films of stage plays, and early television was like radio pictures, reduced movies. Okay, so that's this idea that a new medium grafts itself onto an old medium, eventually until it can kind of form its own identity. And it says far too many comic creators have no higher goal than to match the achievements of other media and view any chance to work in other media as a step up. And there's, of course, comic books down here on the low podium. And again, as long as we view comics as a genre of writing or a style of graphic art, this attitude's never going to change. Okay? It says far too many, same thing there. So this moves on to where we're going to move on to what he talks about the different interaction levels between how words and images function in comic books. And so here is our first panel. This is what's called a word-specific combination. This is where pictures illustrate. Okay, the pictures are just there as ornamentation. They're garnish. They're the extra bit. They're not there to tell the story. The words tell the story. And if we look at some of the examples here, it says, we stumbled back to the apartment shortly before dawn, vomiting every 20 yards. Okay, we got a picture of a sidewalk and some sort of liquid, might be vomit. That's not telling the story. That's just there to enhance or give some garnish, a little bit of extra to what the words are telling us. We don't need it. The words could tell us the story all by itself. Same thing with the next one over there to the other thing. The United States Constitution was adopted by the Second Continental Congress in 1787, put into effect in 1789. Some guy with a pen signing a document. Don't know what document, but we assume the words, it's just there as affectation. And the last one, Judy gave her keys and smiled. We just see her smiling. We didn't need that. It's just extra. A little bit of illumination. All right, our next one is called picture specific, and this is the reverse. This is where, rather than the words, the pictures are the primary storytelling element, and the words are just added. So these first two panels, the guy bowls, he hits the pin, looks to be a strike, and it says he did it. We didn't need those words. We obviously could tell what was going on. All the words do here is give us maybe some sort of extra little, oh, maybe he rolled a perfect game. And then the last three panels that run from the top down on the far right-hand side is obviously some people making out, and the noise is just, again, garnish affectation. All right, then we have what's called duo-specific panels, in which both words and pictures send essentially the same message. So what's going on here is you want to imagine that what the words say and what the images then show us are mirroring each other. So look at this first one. Grim-faced George lifted his lollipop. Okay? I could have either or in this situation. I could have him doing that or the language, because together they're really just kind of repeating each other. And it applies to the other examples as well. They are literally sending the same message. So imagine that these are mirroring. So what's being said is being mirrored in what we're seeing. Okay. Then we have additive. This is where words are used to amplify or elaborate on the image or vice versa. So this is the first example here. My head feels like a smashed pumpkin. So imagine if I took those words away, you would obviously tell that the man has a pain in his head. The words, in a sense, here just sort of give you an allegorical kind of view or analogical kind of view of, oh, it's that bad. Okay. All right, let's look at parallel. This is where the words and pictures seem to follow very different courses without intersecting. Now, ideally in a situation like this, as we'll see in just a second, we obviously, with seeing the rest of the story, we would understand this better. But in this particular panel, what we're seeing and what we're reading don't match up at all. There seems to be no connection. Imagine parallel lines. They don't touch. So let's look at this first top panel. We have a guy walking towards an archway with stairs, and it says, "Talk to Bill yet?" Sally did. Why? The test results came back. All negative. Really? That's great. Well, what are those? There's no direct connection. Now, obviously, hopefully, if we were to see the rest of the story, there would be some sort of explanation. But one, the words appear to be talking about some sort of conversation about a guy getting his test results back, and the image doesn't seem to have any direct connection to that at all. Whereas the one below this is a two-panel image of a boy with a soccer ball, and then he's in a field of grass looking at it underneath the tree, and we have pepper, cereal, milk with butter, and light bulbs, like someone reading off a grocery list. Okay. Now, here's another example. This is a montage where words are treated as an integral part integral parts of the picture. So words themselves sort of form an element within the picture itself. So we have this example here of cash flow, bottom line, annual report, some guy under stress, and then we have the word happy with someone's face standing in for the A. Okay, so think about the old 1960s Batman cartoon, if you've seen that one with Adam West, where they throw up pow and things like that on the screen. They're kind of playing with this montage element. They're making the words or the sound effects part of the element. And then, of course, we have what's probably the most common type. This is what's called the interdependent, where the words and the pictures go hand in hand to convey an idea that neither could convey alone. So I particularly like the one in the top right-hand corner. So first of all, I want you to imagine that all you have is the dialogue, and the dialogue says, "This is all I need to stop him." If you only had that, you would have you'd have something missing. You would not understand what this is, the pronoun here. Okay. Now, if I only had the image with him as raising his hand, that could mean a lot of different things. But if I put them together, all of a sudden I get the distinct impression that all he needs is his bare hands to stop somebody. See, the interdependent meaning. They rely on each other to tell the story. All right, so he talks more here about the interdependent combinations, but before we get to this a little bit, I want to turn and look at some examples that typically we've gone over in class, but I think they'll help illustrate our points a little bit more. So here's more of the post with that, but I've got some imagery here, and so, of course, I've got this first image here of an imaginary story talking about Superman, something about the twilight. There's a lot of words. And then I have the image here with in memoriam. Now, if I look at this, I have to think, okay, what are the purpose of the words? Are they adding something? Because what would we imagine this scene without the words at all? I would obviously, by the in memoriam, reckon that Superman's dead. Whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. So I would say for off this one, though, does feel like it could end up being a duo. I would say most likely this is what we either call a picture specific, where the words are just garnish or affectation, or additive, where they're just simply adding an element to it, okay? Because we can still comprehend something without them, all right? Let's look at this next one here. He looked as if he'd been crying. And we see Superman broke down crying in a room, dogs, statues. I think the best argument for this one would probably be, this could either be duo or additive. Duo because it says he looked as if he'd been crying, and we see him actually doing that, so there is that element there. Or additive in that it's clearly giving us the indication that he is really crying. Okay, image 3, we have a bunch of panels, and I'm going to have us focus in closely and tightly on these last 3 panels. So this first one says here, he turned and walked away in complete silence. I ran after him, calling his name. He didn't reply. Now, this looks initially like it might be a duo specific. All right. But the problem, I think, is that if we didn't have her saying, I calling his name, so we don't see her doing that. So maybe duo specific, maybe additive. Okay, but since the words seem to be drawing the story, we could actually make this case for this being word specific. We maybe don't even need the picture. All right, this next one here and says, by the time I realized where he was heading, it was too late. All right, I think there's a good case in this one for interdependent, primarily because one, this is not directly driving the story, because it's missing something, and this, by seeing this whole keep out gold kryptonite sample storage chamber, kind of gives it, so probably interdependent or additive. All right, and then here's one. It says here, as he walked into the blinding golden light, he turned and looked back over his shoulder. He smiled at me. I never saw Superman again. Now, I think that there's a case here for both word specific and looking closely at the fact that he does look like he's smiling. If I remove this whole I never saw Superman again, I'd even be able to make a strong case that this is duo specific and that it's simply telling me exactly what I'm seeing. So you'll notice here oftentimes there's a lot of fudge room and fuzzy areas for us to play with. So there's a lot of cases for making an argument. All right. Now here's an example that I think is, since the complete lack of words other than the word ha, this is obviously picture specific. The pictures are driving the story. There's almost no words at all. Now this one, I want to look at this image. There's 2 versions of this. I want to look first at these first 2 panels here. Okay? He says, strap yourselves in, brace yourselves. Limbo, you ain't making it any easier. It's not death, it's something new. It's not death. Prepare to become fictional. Now, because there's a strange thing going on here, and we're not exactly sure of the rest of the story, there's room to make this call for this as interdependent. There's also probably room to make a case for this as being even, I would say, parallel. Because we're not exactly sure what the heck he's meaning, and nor does this guy over here. Now, this one right here, this is very either picture specific, but there's also room with this for room to make case for the fact that this might be montage, because here we have words becoming part of the picture itself. Maybe a little bit of both. Now, this is obviously a picture specific, but with the addition of this could be a case to be made that part montage as well. Now, here's one. There were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. Now, it's obviously not montage. The words aren't necessarily giving us a full picture, and there's creatures in here. I think the best choice case here is that there's either interdependent or parallel, because it does seem that maybe these things do need each other, but they don't actually seem to meet up. All right. Now, this is actually lines from the book of Revelation imposed on this picture, and it's only by reading the rest of the story that we're able to make sense. So it probably is a good case for parallel. Now, this one is from the same issue thing here. It says, and I saw 7 angels which stood before God. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar. And the 7 angels prepared themselves to sound. Now, this is not parallel here. One thing, if we closely examine, first of all, it does mention fire, and there is fire present. And if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there are 7 figures. So maybe additive or interdependent would be a stronger case here. Maybe even word specific could be made a case here. All right, let's go down to this image here. And I want to look first at this panel, on the big panel on the left, and then we'll look at the small one. It says, time folds and a new structure rises from the ashen fields of Kansas, an invention of necessity. Now, we could make a case that this is telling the story and that this is just this, so this may be word specific. Perhaps maybe duo could be made a case. And then this one right here where we simply have his face, let's imagine we don't even know that this scene on the left exists. We don't know this is Superman, and it says a stronghold of justice. If we took this panel solely by itself, we could make a case for it being parallel. But if I were to, say, show a full body scene of Superman like this in this panel, it would then be more additive. So you'll see that you can bend the rules here a little bit. Now, this is actually a series of panels I want to look at both separately and together. If I look at them separately, so Doom Planet, Desperate Scientists, Last Hope, Kindly Couple. Now, looking at these first two, I would say the words and the images together kind of create an additive feel. Okay? This one, I could almost make the case for parallel based on the fact that I'm not exactly sure by itself if there's a relationship why Last Hope is being talked about. And of course, this one I return to the idea of additive. Together, it's kind of a little bit of an additive / interdependent, maybe even picture specific, because what we're telling here is actually the origin of Superman in just 4 panels. And then, of course, we're going to come to a last one here, and this is one of my favorite ones I like to look at. I'm sorry, second to last one. This one with no words here, this is obviously picture specific. Again, picture specific here, no words. Now, if we take this image, this panel by itself here, your doctor really did get held up, Reagan. It's never as bad as it seems. It almost seems parallel unless we connect back to the fact that we do see her cell phone, and that's obviously someone calling. In this case, it then goes from being parallel to being a little bit more additive. And of course, it ends again additive and then to picture specific, perhaps even interdependent. Okay. Now, this last one I want to look at, and I want to look at in 3 phases. First of all, I want to start by looking at these first 3 panels here. Okay, there's obviously some laughing. Oh, do excuse me, haha, heh. It seems to be driven by picture specific, so I would say that the words are garnish here. Again, this would probably, this panel alone would probably be duo specific. Okay. Now, once we reach these two panels here, we have very, very seriously entered the realm of montage. And of course, then we end on a little bit of montage picture specific. All right. And that concludes our